Today I would like to investigate a little why things have turned out the way they have. For now that the dust has settled, and we all have had ample time to reflect, it may be a good time to cast a light on why Donald Trump won the presidency, and Britain voted for Brexit. On the face of it, these are two entirely different subjects, but closer examination shows them to be related, and I know to be far from alone in that conclusion. In fact, there seems to be a feeling that the sentiments behind these two tremendous political shocks coming from the English-speaking world are far from exhausted and will sweep across the Western world. So what exactly lies behind it all? After all, large sections of the population, both in the UK as well as the US, still remain in complete disbelief as to these occurrences. They simply cannot understand what has happened. So what fueled this? As usual for something so large, so profound, there is no singular reason. There were several key elements to this. Large sections of the population had grown increasingly dissatisfied, but felt they were completely unrepresented. Their views did not count, because their views were unacceptable. They were the unwashed plebs who did not understand the world properly. So the media and the political sphere chose to disregard them entirely. This, despite their becoming an ever greater constituency. I guess one of the first examples of this was when Prime Minister Gordon Brown was on the campaign trail in the British general election of 2010, which he was set to lose. On one of those contrived press occasions when Brown was set to meet selected people in Rochdale town centre, Gordon Brown was confronted publicly by a dear old lady called Gillian Duffy, who wanted to know what he was about to do regarding immigration. She was most adamant that something needed to be done, and complained that any mention of this issue always resulted in accusations of racism. Gordon Brown smiled warmly, and did all the things politicians do. Once he had left, no one was any the wiser, for as a professional politician he had been as non-committal as ever. However, there was a sting in the tail. The Prime Minister was wearing a wireless microphone, which was still on. So the press cameras picked up on his berating his assistants in his limousine about how it had been allowed that he should meet that terrible woman. He then went on to call her an out-and-out bigot. I shall put a link to a Guardian transcript of this confrontation in the notes. Now you see, ladies and gentlemen, that was already back in 2010, proving that these things do not come about overnight. They grow. Had they been addressed back then, Trump and Brexit might never have happened. But the issues remained unaddressed. They festered. The European Union had expanded into Eastern Europe. But much like NAFTA in the US, this meant the juxtaposition within a trade bloc of countries, which were vastly divergent in wealth and development. Not only did Britain now live under the permanent threat of any corporation removing its factories from the UK to some place in Slovakia or Poland, but at the same time the agreements on freedom of movement meant a massive influx of immigrants into the wealthy and liberal United Kingdom. If at first Britain proved quite welcoming, especially to the Poles, with whom she has shared an affinity ever since back in the Second World War, soon the cracks began to show. The wealthy and the upper middle classes benefited from this influx of cheap labour, but the working classes felt they were being squeezed dry. However, as Gordon Brown's example illustrated, this was not an issue. One was not going to pander to racism and xenophobia. But in truth, the working classes were not being racist. They were crying out for help, and none came. Especially not from a Labour government, which showed how out of touch the Labour movement had become from its working class roots. They simply did not understand. Moreover, they did not even want to try to understand. What wonder, then, that their government fell? In America, much the same was happening. Factories were closing everywhere. I remember my late friend Mo from New York State telling me that there had been a recession going on in the USA for years at the time of our speaking, which was more than a decade ago. He told me of rusting, abandoned factories and steelworks closing, with no replacement industries anywhere. Yet the US economy was not reflecting this at all. The profits were still being made. Everything was still growing, on paper, on the balance sheets of Apple and Starbucks. The politicians merely looked at such statistics and patted themselves on the back. Everything was doing well. But blue-collar workers themselves were experiencing none of this. To them, this was a real, long-term recession. Not only were they hurting, but nobody cared. The city of Detroit has become a monument to this attitude. A once mighty industrial city, which played a huge part in America's industrial history, was simply left to rot. No governmental effort seems to have been made to replace dying industries with anything else. At last the city declared bankruptcy, and now nobody knows what can be done. The policies of farming out first-world jobs to poorer nations has worked wonders for said nations. We have witnessed veritable economic miracles. Eastern Europe has risen much like Phoenix from the ashes. So too Mexico, China, India have boomed. Europe and the US have continued to show some growth, mainly through their farming out much of their production to those other countries. But all this has gone to the moneyed interests. Capitalism was not really working for the blue-collar classes anymore, because the corporations instead chose to go elsewhere, where living standards were lower and wages were much, much cheaper. American and Western European workers simply found themselves abandoned. This was free market economics, we were told. This was inherently good. It created more wealth than any other system. But clearly people were beginning to doubt this. They realized they were being sold a rotten deal. Free market economics can indeed work better than any other system, within given rules. So free trade agreements between highly developed countries with similar levels of wealth would be fair deals. A country like Great Britain is not simply going to undercut the American worker by using labour which works for pennies in sweatshop conditions. Trade deals between developed nations were the model, but now they were being applied to dirt-poor nations, totalitarian dictatorships, and countries 1 or 2 centuries behind on the scale of societal evolution. To ask American workers to justify their own jobs in the face of such competition seemed grossly unfair. The workers were not competing on a level playing field. Everything was tilted in favour of the nations with poor, uneducated masses, whose ruling elites had never bothered to develop the place. US and European workers were now faced with the cost of living in an expensive developed society, but were expected to compete with people living in Filipino slums or else lose their jobs. At last one politician emerged in America who actually acknowledged the problem: Donald Trump. His rise was meteoric, because a disillusioned worker class suddenly shifted from the political left to the right. They wanted something done, and he was the only one who was even willing to try. In the UK, similar things have happened surrounding a man called Nigel Farage. His UKIP party began addressing the people's concerns that something was running awry. While all other politicians were firmly left with their heads stuck in the sand, Farage was at least willing to acknowledge that there was a problem. Then there is the much talked about media bias. This seemed to be a more significant factor, I think, than some are willing to acknowledge. The people got wise to the fact that the Fourth Estate was in cahoots with the politicians. The media coverage, both on Brexit and the US presidential election, was quite shocking. We're all used to some media bias, but this was of a different order. This was propaganda on a level which equaled Soviet-style news reporting. The upper echelons of society were literally conniving with each other. This was both the case in the Brexit vote, as well as in the presidential election. They were lying so blatantly that it was plain to see. Yet they somehow convinced themselves that this would be free of consequence. However, it provoked a veritable rebellion. People were not going to be lied to on that scale. They were not going to be told that, if they disbelieved this narrative, they were all fools or racists. During Brexit, the bias was palpable. But nothing prepared us for the outright corruption of broadcasting and news reporting, which took place during the presidential election. And I include not only US media in this. Here in Britain, the BBC peddled much the same sort of fake news, which NBC or CNN were pushing. This was not even their patch. But so partisan were they could not help themselves. it was quite scandalous. Not only were the news media peddling outright lies, but they were of such scale they can never have hoped to keep them under wraps. In fact, they cannot even have truly believed that folks would imagine them to be the truth. Instead, they were concerned merely with the consistency of their narratives. As long as that held water, they felt they were on safe ground, no matter whether the facts were blatantly untrue and the perspective was growing increasingly warped. Just as in the Brexit vote, where the hyperbole were increasingly nonsensical and were turning people away, in the US election the portrayal of Donald Trump on one side and that of Hillary Clinton on the other were becoming ever more farcical. Increasingly, Donald Trump was described as the enemy of the American people. Hillary Clinton, corrupt and morally bankrupt as she self-evidently was somehow being portrayed as America's only hope. This could impossibly continue. Media, politicians, and polling companies were increasingly bending their own perspective to reaffirm that they were winning, when in fact their very behavior was turning people away. Thus the media was not only lying, it was beginning to believe its own lies. The denial of reality is what we saw on both sides of the Atlantic. One was so invested in one idea that nothing could come between one's desired outcome and the inevitability of success. Victory was a certainty. Both Nigel Farage and Donald Trump were buffoons, whereas their opponents were statesmanlike and wise. This one might have stomached, but it was far from all. The media turned not only on the politicians they did not like, but also attacked any would-be supporters. Both Trump and Brexit supporters were to varying degrees suggested to be closed-minded, isolationist, racist, xenophobic, and even fascist. In the American election, sexism also came into it. Not merely due to Trump's pussy-grabbing faux pas, but so too long before that, because Hillary Clinton was a woman. Therefore, to oppose her was to oppose women. It was women's turn. There should be a woman president. It was only fair. Thus, any other outcome would be unfair. All this flew in the face of reality. Hillary Clinton, of whom we were told that she was the best qualified candidate ever, was gradually ever more revealed to be utterly unsuitable to the office of president. Day after day, WikiLeaks reported ever more damning stories. She even collapsed in public, revealing that she had not the necessary physical health to take this office. None of this mattered. Hillary was best. Hillary was in fact the only option. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, Britain was going to collapse. The financial ramifications of Brexit would be monstrous. She could not hope to survive on her own. Britain was weak, dependent, and inextricably tied into an EU structure from which secession was practically impossible. Staying in the EU was for her own good. Britain was a mere child who needed to be told what to do. People bristled at that. The British are a proud people. They famously do not know when they are beaten. They will not be told that a situation is hopeless, or that they, as a people, are not up to the challenge. America too was being told that it was tied in. Things had been sorted by wiser heads. Great supranational organizations had done the thinking on the people's behalf. This was the best for which they could hope. Hence Hillary Clinton's proposed course of continuing the existing policies was the only way. If people were struggling, that was just an inevitable consequence of progress. They would need to get used to it. Both in Britain and in the USA, the establishment message was so bereft of hope that one wonders what they were thinking. People were effectively being asked to submit. The political message was all wrong. Meanwhile, there appeared to be real alienation between the ordinary people of Britain and America and the rich. The Americans may be much more squeamish about spelling this out, as they feel it undermines their capitalist credentials, but the sentiment is there. Britain, the nation that virtually invented free global trade, is more at ease with criticizing the excesses of capitalism. Over the last 10 to 20, possibly 30 years, the wealth has flowed to the few. But our democracies depend on there being a shared experience of wealth. People are happy to see successful individuals prosper if they in turn also may hope to give their children a better start in life, and also if they feel that the wealth others acquire is in fact earned. But this is far from what is the case. If anything, the working and lower middle class is regressing, and some of the exorbitant incomes of the executives beggar belief. Nobody begrudges a Bill Gates who built a global empire out of nothing his wealth. He made it. He should be free to enjoy the fruits of it. But a chief executive of a multinational corporation is in fact nothing more than a glorified employee. He did not build that company. It was built decades or even centuries ago. Why should he help himself to millions? That people begrudge. Meanwhile, the ordinary people do not get to share in the increased wealth of their societies, of the economies they have helped craft with their contribution. They are in fact less well off, whilst others seem to garner nigh on limitless wealth. This is a problem, not because of envy as is always alleged, but because if this trend continues, then in double short time the super rich will own everything. Meanwhile, the regular people will gradually, day by day, encroach upon that dreaded poverty line. Social mobility, as we experienced it in the past, has all but ceased. Of course there are some rags to riches stories. There always have been. But the great swathe of the people sees no way up the ladder. This is not least the case because the chasm between ordinary workers and their bosses has become greater than ever. The middle management jobs have dried up. There are fewer and fewer stepping stones. People are beginning to ask where this is going to lead. One is perfectly willing to partake in the great capitalist economy, but one feels that, just like the media, things are becoming rigged. The fact that the banks, which in their insane drive for bonuses and increasing lack of understanding of their own business, almost drove the world economy into the ground, were then saved, and have walked away scot-free in that respect, proved the point. I enclose the link in the notes to an episode of the Jimmy Dore show. For those who cannot bear Jimmy Dore, there is a link to the academic's original monologue before he incorporated it into his show. I mention Jimmy Dore as it was on his output that I was first made aware of a piece by Mark Blyth. Now sure, Jimmy Spit and Run Away Dore does his usual spiel, but the clip of Mark Blyth, a political analyst from Brown University, is really enlightening. Now I know many of you will roll your eyes at talk of long-term economy, but bear with me. This will make sense, and it is a significant factor of which anyone who wishes to fully understand the Trump-Brexit phenomenon must be aware. Mark Blyth speaks of a cycle of 30 years. After the Second World War, governments decided to target full employment as their chief priority. Those returning troops needed jobs. It worked. But sooner or later, if you run a system which is driven by a government agenda, some parties learn how to game the system. He refers to this rule as a Lucas critique. Within about 30 years, the system began to fail. The unions and employers were exploiting the government bias. Inflation ran out of control. Things started failing from about 1975 onwards. Exactly that sweet spot of 30 years. What followed were several years of turmoil and failure. Things were going nowhere. As it happens, Margaret Thatcher was elected in 1979. Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, taking office in 1981. These two leaders, once again of the two predominant nations among the English-speaking world, got together in their vision of a new way. It was harsh. It caused great pain on either side of the Atlantic. But the ship needed turning around if it was not to hit the iceberg. They succeeded. But whereas Ronald Reagan is now largely credited for a decent presidency, Margaret Thatcher's standing has never recovered from the economic pain she had to inflict in order to turn things around. But whichever way you look at it, they did the right thing. But something was still askew. The money was heading one way. The rich were garnering most of it. we were beginning to see the coming of the age of the super-rich. Though unlike Mark Blyth, I do think the population at large did benefit. However, this 1980s monetary policy, which was to keep inflation under control, has now had its 30-year run. Once again, some players have learned to game the system. Banks realise they can do what they want, as governments cannot afford to let them fail. Multinational corporations just about refuse to pay tax, citing that if they do not find the climate amenable, they will simply take their jobs elsewhere. Both Britain and the US are running high deficits, while their corporations are devising ever new schemes on how to avoid paying anything. And here is where we come upon a paradox. For the corporations are happy to exploit the rich markets of Europe and the US, but do not want to partake in keeping the populations wealthy enough to maintain these markets. There was a famous Swiss industrialist called Maggi. Well, I say famous. He's famous on the European mainland. His company is still going today. He produced soups at the time, much like Campbell's soup. But it was a luxury product. It was the rich and well-to-do who bought his products. When his fellow industrialists complained to him that he was driving up wages by paying his workers too much, Maggi replied he wanted his workers, as well as everyone else's, to earn more. For should they do so, they would begin buying his products, and that market would dwarf that of the rich and well-to-do. He is generally regarded as a visionary. The European and American markets are precisely so attractive because the masses earn a good living. But as Maggi said, this is as much in the interest of the big companies as it is in the interest of the workers. However, if the corporations break this social contract and move all their jobs to Mexico and Turkey, but still hope to sell their goods into the mass markets of the US and Europe, then this will not work in the long term. It is plain to see. The markets benefit from the wealth of their workers. If you deprive your workers of that wealth because you hope to increase your profit margin, then you do so at the long-term cost of ruining the market, and in turn your own business. But let us come back to Mark Blyth. He finishes by pointing out that Wall Street bonuses in 2015, 7 years after the bailout, totaled $28.4 billion. We, the people, have saved the banks. None of them would have a job without us, due to their own actions. And now they are back to paying themselves king's ransoms. And what does society get? The bill for bailing them out. This will not fly. The system is broken. As I said before, the feeling is that much like the media, the economic system is rigged. This is precisely why we are seeing Brexit, why we are seeing Trump. The people are seeking a new way, a new solution. A new Thatcher, a new Reagan. Someone has to hammer out a new way forward, for the present course is not working. Plainly, if we do not change it, it will end in disaster. Meanwhile, on one thing Donald Trump is completely and indisputably right. There are effectively two categories of free trade. If Mexico sells genuine Mexican tequila into the US, that fits perfectly within the parameters of free trade. They make it. It is theirs. They sell it to the Americans who want to buy it. Why should there be tariffs? Why should government get in the way of that? But if Mexico sells into the US goods which only last week were made in the US itself, then Mexico is effectively robbing US workers and forming a parasitic relationship with America, whereby she produces American goods of which she sells virtually nothing in her own country, and sells all in the US. The USA thereby only garners all the downsides. A trade deficit, no tax revenue from the factory or the workers, and no jobs for any of its labor force. This is a separate category of free trade. These are not Mexican products. They are US products, effectively operating in something akin to a tax haven. It is exploitative. It is destructive. And yes, it must be stopped. This is not protectionism in its traditional sense. It is a first step to bring corporatism back under control. Corporations are not sovereign in our countries. We are. We, the people. Of course, one of the more European aspects in this is that of the superstate. Now, America has also witnessed ever more centralized power, and people feel increasingly remote from the decisions which govern their supposed democracy. But in Europe, in the EU, things have taken on a completely different dimension. Europe is unashamedly a state in the making. It seeks literally to subsume its members. Nation-states are to become mere regions within a European superstructure. But the nations of Europe have proud histories. The Dutch, Spanish and Portuguese explorers opened up the world. The Italians and Greeks gave us our basic civilizations. The Norsemen of Scandinavia have a shining history. Russia is a nigh-on biblical power, contesting supremacy not merely with the great powers of the world, but so too with nature herself. Britain and France are most likely the two greatest civilizing influences on the planet since ancient Rome. Oh, and there's also the Germans, but let's not get into that. All that is to be set at naught for some bland, uninspired institution in which nobody feels any sense of pride, which has achieved nothing and cannot command the loyalty of any people. Europe was a dream. At its outset it was a worthy attempt. But it is over. Maybe her wounded body will drag itself on for some time, but the proud, indomitable nations of Europe will not be yoked to some commissariat which passes edicts on what is to happen. And the people will no longer tolerate the exorbitant corruption of some of the most expensive yet unproductive parliamentarians on earth. The European Parliament is a disgrace. They have feasted. No wonder all were completely sold on maintaining the status quo. For who would kill the goose that laid the golden eggs? For years now the EU's accounts have never been accepted. Billions are unaccounted for and nobody seems to care. One simply produces yet another breakdown of how one has spent the money the following year, and once again billions are missing. Meanwhile, European Union politicians airily wave away any questions. Why should one answer? There is no need. The people cannot hold them accountable anyhow. To the people of the oldest parliamentary democracy on earth, this was anathema. The British, who were net contributors to Europe, wanted to know where the money was going. They wanted politicians to answer, at least be visible, identifiable. For, as Nigel Farage so colourfully pointed out in the lion's den of the European Parliament itself, no one knows who they are, what position they fulfil. They are virtually anonymous and thus free to do as they like. My personal hope is that the EU experiment has not damaged my nation so far that it should lead to her breakup. For Scotland has been encouraged, emboldened and stoked to feel wronged, betrayed and embittered towards her sister England. In times these wounds may heal, if left alone. But it is far from a coincidence that a Scottish nationalist member of the European Parliament received rapturous applause after his defiant speech immediately after the Brexit. Britain is in real danger now. One can but hope that the Scottish people possess the wisdom to realise that they are being manipulated and played for fools by malign forces. A final point, which is inevitable when considering Trump and Brexit, is immigration. In the US it took the form of illegal immigration. In Britain it was legal, but people feared for their country, not because they were xenophobic, as was always alleged, but because they felt that change was running out of control, and that this would change the character of their nation forever. In America too, there is the allegation of an embittered white majority, feeling the sting of demographics, and fearing for its hold on power. But that is to make this about skin tone, whereas it is a question of identity. True, the Americans are an immigrant people, but they have built themselves an identity all of their own. They are unique, and they feel pride in their way of life and draw enjoyment from it. But when they see masses of people from different cultures who show little intent on assimilating, then they begin to worry for their future, for their children's way of life. The same in Britain. Having grown up on the continent of Europe, I can tell you that there are nations of a much less advanced temperament to those of Britain and France. For Britain and France were the great colonial powers. Paris and London were the great metropolises long before any other nation possessed one. Still today, only New York has joined them as an equal. You would find within their precincts all colour and creed of the world. Both Britain and France were open to the world. They traded, they experienced the variety of the globe. Some of their adventurers are legend. Should you not believe me, Google White Rajas of Sarawak. This bestriding of the globe took these two great cultures far beyond the limited evolution of their European neighbours. For many European nations are not long removed from being mere peasant countries. And it shows. They have nothing like the depth of civilization of the two great nations of Western Europe. But to lead this back into the subject of immigration, the British were therefore perfectly at ease with their historical legacy of immigrants from the far reaches of their empire. So too the French. Both London and Manchester possess a Chinatown. The weaving towns of the northeast of England have a historical, prominent population from the Indian subcontinent. Afro-Caribbean immigration, mainly from Jamaica, had brought many blacks to our shores who lived mainly in the inner cities. Independent Pakistani corner shops became synonymous with Britain. Chinese ran many fish and chip shops, serving up fried Chinese foods alongside the famous British dish. Curry houses were a marvellous success all across the nation. None of this was a problem. But about 10-15 years ago, there was a shift. Small towns, even villages, suddenly experienced large surges in immigration. What we had known to be the nature of our metropolises was now suddenly spreading into the hinterland. All of England, all of Scotland, all of Wales was now to become like London, like Manchester. It was that at which the people balked. They liked the traditional colour and diversity of their great imperial cities, but they failed to understand why each and every small town was to follow their example. Somewhere there must still be room for England, for Scotland. The people bristled at being called racist, for instead they were merely concerned about their own homeland. But this concern, this love of England or Scotland, was no longer permitted. More so, our great civilization was nothing special at all. There was nothing worthy of protection. For in the great scheme of things, all civilizations, all culture, is much the same, we were told. It was this oppressive form of multiculturalism which was one of the causes for people to rebel. It was one of the reasons that you heard people say that they wanted their country back. Now the other great nation across the Channel faces an equal question. They too come from the very same place. An imperial power at ease with diversity, but refusing to accept the gradual subversion of their own native culture. Anyhow, I have gone on for long enough. I hope I have helped define some of the feelings and sentiment behind what I see as the Trump and Brexit phenomenon. I did not go into the Swiss example, simply for fear of making this too complicated. But tough little Switzerland must be credited with being the nation which first stood up and said no. Either way, I think I've made plain that to my mind this is a multi-layered phenomenon. It has several causes, not each of which will necessarily apply to every supporter. For some it may have been this point or that which swayed them. But like in all such movements, people of different backgrounds, with different reasons and different causes, come together to unite in the face of adversity. That is all from the Cyberpass for now. Thank you very much, and goodbye.